Thank you, everyone. I honestly cannot tell you how excited I am to be here. I always tell people at tech conferences that I'm a recovering academic. So I'm like, yes, I'm a recovering tech person in this room. So a little bit about me or my background. I am the global head of diversity and inclusion at Atlassian. We're a multinational collaboration and productivity software company headquartered in Sydney. But we have about 1,000 folks here in the US, 3 Bay Area offices, and somewhere in Austin. My background is I was actually working on a PhD in political science. So if you want to talk about democratic military strategy or mercenaries, let me know. But that is not what I get to talk about a lot today. But to kind of frame the conversation, and I was really excited about this sort of confluence of business and of academia. But when I was thinking about what I could say that was interesting to you all, because I'm sure a lot of the folks in the room have read a lot of the research on the topic, I wanted to frame it around a set of questions. And they're the set of questions that I run into every day in my work. And I probably won't give you all the answers. I'm really sorry about that. But I don't think that any good professional in D&I would. So to start, I want to talk a little bit about how I got into D&I from studying mercenaries. So first, I decided not to finish my PhD, so props to all of you who are joiners, not quitters. But I landed in the tech industry because I had to pay my rent, and someone gave me a job. I was like, yes, I can sell software. I can't work my iPhone, but I can sell software. And I looked around, and I was the only queer Latina woman I could find. And I was like, statistically, that cannot make sense. We're in California. And I got really freaked out, to be totally honest. Like, it was so white and so male and kind of bro-y. And I was in a sorority, I get it. But it didn't make sense to me, the group of people that I was seeing around me. And I was like, this is a system. I've always loved systems thinking. And when I started to try to engage in conversations about increased diversity or inclusion or how to mitigate bias, what I heard was, well, we're a meritocracy. And I was like, well, that's bullshit. Or we would see more brown people here. And so I took a really aggressive left turn from business development to running semi-secret experiments on our recruiting process, and basically showed them, as probably no one in the room is shocked, that there is unconscious bias against female developers in code reviews. So what we found, and what's awesome is that we were able to optimize against it, was that female candidates applying for engineering roles were 1/3 less likely to receive a phone interview based on their code. And I know it was only based on their gender because I put different names on the same code, right? It's like not even an interesting research design. And so they were like, oh, that's useful and saves us money. You can do that full time. And so, right? Yes. So that's how I ended up where I am. And everyone's like, you're the expert. I'm like, I ask more questions and give answers. But that's my story of how I did this. And to kind of borrow a line from The Martian, as I've gone along, I've become more sure about one thing, which is that you can science the shit out of this problem, right? So to ground a little bit in what I want to call the latest wave of tech diversity, because obviously there has been an amazing history of people advocating for increased diversity and inclusion in the STEM fields for a long time. But I really want to pinpoint the fact that it was really 2013 when the Silicon Valley actually started having honest and real conversations about what was happening. So in a Medium post in October 2013, then Pinterest engineer Tracy Chow, who went to that school down on the peninsula, released a blog post and put up a GitHub repository. And she said, where are the numbers? How many women are actually in engineering positions in the Valley? And she did this with the blessing of her founder, which is pretty awesome. But other companies started to join. And that repository still exists, but it actually turned into something bigger. The women in the Valley, the people of color in the Valley, started looking around and saying, yeah, count me, count us. And that culminated in 2014 in Google, who everyone looks to set trends in the industry, releasing their first diversity report. And it didn't stop from there. So companies all over the Valley started releasing those reports to the point that at this point, if you don't release one, people wonder if there's a reason why. So in February 2015, despite the fact that she filed the case in 2012 against her former employer, venture capital firm, Kleiner Perkins, Ellen Pao lost her gender discrimination case. Her book is coming out next week. The excerpts are great. I suggest everyone read it. And at the risk of being a little self-promotional, I joined Atlassian in June 2015. And in March 2016, we released our first diversity report. And we released a diversity report that not only looks at corporate statistics, but also looks at diversity at the team level. Atlassian.com/diversity, want to check it out. But the idea is we want folks to not only know what the aggregate makeup of our company is, but also what the distribution of those people across the organization is. What does the average team look like within a particular department? Because we fundamentally believe that transparency and openness is also one of the keys to solving this problem. What we also see is that outside of all of these scandals that we're seeing, Ellen Pao, Susan Fowler, Erica Baker, that a lot of these women have not only raised their voices in advocacy of themselves and standing up to right injustices that have happened to them, but they've turned into some of the leading voices in this industry, not only pushing for change on behalf of themselves, but on behalf of their communities and other marginalized communities as well. A lot of them banded together in 2016 to launch something called Project Include, projectinclude.org, if you're not familiar. And it's both a set of resources for startups and the venture capital community about how to build more inclusive environments. And then they also, in their spare time, which I don't know where they find it, also run actually what they call Startup and VC Include, where they work specifically with founders and diversity and inclusion leaders at startups. Because the thesis is by the time you're at 50,000 people, it's really hard. Right, my metaphor that I tell people is like, it's really easy to turn a paddle boat and really hard to turn the Titanic, right? And so I can tell you, as someone who set up diversity and inclusion functions at 2 high-growth companies, it's still really hard when you start at 1,000 people. I've been with Atlassian from about 1,000 to 2,200 now. And while we've made some great gains, the fact is to be representative of the communities that we operate in is going to be an incredible challenge over the next 10 years. But I want to talk about some of the important questions that we're trying to answer. So why are we pushing for diversity and inclusion anyway? Is there a case that there actually is inequity in the system? And what would be the value of us investing billions of dollars in solving this problem? Well, first, there's really obvious evidence that tech companies are struggling with talent. So right now today, there are 1 million cybersecurity jobs in the world for whom there is no one qualified to fill them. As we see increased automation and technology becoming a part of every business, that talent squeeze is only going to get worse. So it seems a little bit disingenuous when people say, we're having talent struggles, but we won't hire Black people, right? Like what? So there's that. There's the pure business case that we need more people with these technological skills working in these organizations that, as you said, are becoming more and more influential. I believe it was Ben Horowitz who said that software is eating the world. If that quote's wrong, I apologize. But the fact is that every company is becoming a software and technology company, at least in the back office, if not out front selling their products. And so that also means that because these things are becoming more and more influential, if we don't actually understand a broad set of people's challenges and experiences in the world, technology is going to serve less and less of the world population. That's just a fundamental thing. The way that I talk about it internally is that people solve the problems they have. It's really hard to solve a problem you've never heard of. And if your biggest problem is that you can't get pizza at 11 p.m. on Thursday, then that's the problem you're going to solve. Yes, I do have 6 food delivery apps on my phone. And the other thing is that we know that diversity and inclusion drives innovation, especially in the knowledge economy. So this may not make sense when Henry Ford was running cars down an assembly line, but work isn't that way anymore. Business is changing more and more. Innovation is what is creating business value. And there's some pretty great research on this. So if anyone is familiar with Scott Page, I really strongly recommend reading The Difference. He also just came out with a new book that I'm about halfway through that's specifically about diversity in teams. But the whole theory, Page's theory, is predicated on the idea that everyone has a set of mental toolboxes, and that those are basically constructed through your life experiences, the education that you've had, and that individuals or teams with sets of values that are aligned, but perspectives or cognitive toolboxes that are different, they solve problems better. And again, that's a little overly academic, but it kind of makes sense, right? If you're good at one thing and I'm good at another, we're probably going to get stuck less often if we're both only good at one thing. And so it's increasingly important because we have to fill the skills gap. We have to actually grow and innovate, and we need to serve a broader population than Silicon Valley has to the past. And frankly, it's also just a simple matter of social justice. The longer it takes us to solve these problems, what we already see is there's increased income inequality, significantly increased gaps in access to opportunity. The US was actually just reclassified as a developing nation based on the type of opportunities that are available to low-income Americans. That's pretty horrifying. And technology can be used to solve those problems, but if it's not aware of that, because the people that make up the technology industry are not even aware that the problem exists, then it's highly unlikely that problem is going to get solved. A lot of research that's come out of McKinsey, for example, frankly just shows that gender and ethnically diverse companies are more likely to financially outperform their peers. Diverse teams are actually happier, more creative, more innovative. People who are on diverse teams show greater emotional commitment to their colleagues and more likely to retain in their organizations. So whether you're really excited about social justice, driving someone's shareholder value, right? All of these things point in the same direction. So I often find it really confusing to say, okay, great, we can all make money and we're gonna be happier and we do social good. Why is this so damn hard? But it is really hard. First, because we don't even really know what the end goal is. So if you took a survey of all of the CDOs in my email inbox, you'd probably get about 12 different answers to that question. And I actually don't have a problem with that, shockingly. I don't think that the industry needs a shared definition of the goal. And my reason is pretty simple. All companies are different, and so what their goals are should be different. For Atlassian, our long-term goal is to have each of our offices reflect the diversity of the communities in which we're based. So, for example, we're based in Sydney. When I came in, I was American. I was like, we're going to fight for justice for Hispanic people. And half my employees were like, what does that word mean? Right? Like, my CEO pinged me like 2 weeks ago, and he was like, Cuban is Latino, right? Because he's Australian. Like, the entire construct of like the Hispanic identity is just like, you have to teach that first, right? And so for us as a global business, taking a look at racial and ethnic equity outside of our US offices just doesn't make any sense because the entire construct is different. So for us, we think about a strategy and a philosophy that's globally cohesive, that we want our organization to reflect the communities that we're in and to see that we see no statistically significant differences in experience across cohorts. That's really fun to say in all my HR meetings. And so that works for us. So that's our answer. A lot of people have also said, especially for American companies, that they want their companies to reflect the diversity of the United States. Intel, an incredible company who has done so much work in this space, and Barbara Wai, who leads the D&I work there, their goal is actually to ensure that they are hiring and retaining and advancing at market availability. So looking at the specialties that they have in their organization and saying, are we taking full and active advantage of the talent pools that exist, right? So all of those answers are okay, but I think it creates a lot of confusion in the dialogue because lots of companies have different goals, and so people end up talking past each other, right? And especially for advocates who are not D&I professionals, they can struggle to articulate that in a way that makes it really hard to win an argument, right? So you're like, what's the point? Well, I don't know. That's really hard. So what I would tell everyone is take a look at the landscape of what companies are doing in this space. What kind of goals are they setting? The other thing that's really important is that there's a difference between long-term and short-term goals. I'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about data and measurement. But it is absolutely unacceptable or impossible to think that this will be achieved in a couple of years. So, and not to throw any particular media under the bus, but it was like about 2016 when I started putting together my first diversity report that all of the headlines were about, well, Google's only moved 2 percentage points. And I'm like, you thought Google was going to undo structural racism in 2 years? Like, really? That doesn't make sense to me, and it doesn't make sense from a math perspective. So understanding that long-term goal while also thinking about what your interim goals are. At Atlassian, we have goals around the distribution in our candidate funnels, around what our hiring targets should be, but the fact is we've embraced progress over perfection as a philosophy. As long as we're moving in the right direction, that's great. We have some pretty aggressive targets to get there, but understand that this is a 10-year to 20-year problem. That's okay. But accepting that, I think, is also healthy for advocates, because the fact is that for those of us working in this space, compassion fatigue is real. And activists also suffer mental health issues, so I'm pushing for, against structural inequality forever. And so being realistic about what you're trying to achieve and the timeline that you're trying to achieve it on is really crucial, and something we should all be honest about when we discuss it. And then, how do you know when you've got inclusion? So this is even harder. What you'll notice about all of the tech companies is that they put out diversity reports. They don't put out inclusion reports. And the reason for that is that measuring inclusion is actually really, really hard. I think the best thing that's floating around the industry right now is an amazing survey that was put together by Culture Amp, which is an employee engagement survey, and Paradigm, which is an amazing D&I consulting firm. So there's a really long battery of questions around inclusion. But what's starting to emerge is that inclusion isn't actually the thing we should be looking at. So it turns out that this concept of belonging, while different from inclusion, is actually one of the single best predictors of whether someone retains and grows at a company. And interestingly enough, as someone who I really love survey research, independent projects at Microsoft and LinkedIn actually looked at all of the academic research around measuring belonging. And I think there's been a total of, I think, 131 questions that have been constructed to measure belonging in the academic research. And they actually internally tested those questions to see what were most predictive, both of that experience and also of different employment outcomes. The number one statement, or yeah, I guess it's a statement, to measure belonging is, I feel like I belong at my company. Right? You're like, that's true. All the survey researchers are like, whoa, that was easy. But it's true, right? And you can construct more difficult batteries, but what we're finding at Atlassian is that feeling, and specifically that feeling of belonging on your team, is actually what matters. So we're beginning to look at measuring constructs around both, do people feel like they belong at the company, and do they belong at their team? And what we're seeing is that, along with asking people about job-seeking behavior, is actually, we're able to predict pretty closely our 6 and 12-month attrition rates, which is cool because it means you can stop it before it happens. But how do you know when you've got inclusion? The fact is, you will never have a perfect measure. And I know that's really, really unsatisfying because you can't publish off of that. But you can still do a lot of things with it. So accepting the idea that inclusion is a moving target and that you're never going to get it perfect is actually the concept that I've seen helps you teach it. A little bit counterintuitively, and especially to engineers. So if you've ever worked, especially with software engineers, they tend to be very binary thinkers, right? They spend a lot of their time working in very rigid rules and very black and white. And so they can struggle a lot with talking about these topics that are basically gray by default, right? So there are no hard rules about how not to or to be inclusive outside of sort of like, don't be straight up racist or sexist or ableist, all of those things. And so telling people that it's a process of learning how to grow and be better, and how to take the orientation that you're taking ownership of the impact your actions have on others, that suddenly is like not so terrifying. But what I find is that these words, diversity and inclusion, people have really strong emotional reactions to them, and they're often really negative. Actual quote from one of my employees, I don't know which one because it was an anonymous question, a couple of weeks ago said, I'm a white man and I always feel like I'm on the wrong side of diversity. What can I do? And I was like, there's no right or wrong side, right? But that shows that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of where we're going and what the definitions we're using are. I had to get up in front of the whole company and say, you know, if we didn't have any white men, we'd have the same problem in reverse, right? Like, stay here, I'm bringing people. And so that's really important too, is what is diversity? It's this cognitive toolbox, and we're proxying for that cognitive toolbox using demographic characteristics. And what is inclusion? It's just the feeling that you feel good where you are, right? We can get into really academic definitions, but it's pretty basic. And the other thing that I've found is that people actually understand the concept of exclusion better, right? So I'm sure everyone in the room can imagine a moment or a time in their life when they felt like they didn't belong, like they were excluded in a space. And when you take people on that journey, you're like, I actually just want people to stop feeling that. People are suddenly like, oh, okay, that's what we're trying to do. So now that we've talked about the fact that we don't have a good idea of what the goals are, or at least there's not a uniform understanding of them, I want to talk about one of the things that gets in the way. So this, who's had that conversation? Yeah, right? Like, we don't want to lower the bar. Like, on what data-driven assumptions are you basing that statement? Right? There's this like idea that like, oh, and maybe I'm a little too direct, but if I see a lack of diversity in an organization, that is the first piece of evidence that it isn't a meritocracy, right? So the tech industry, especially but not exclusively in Silicon Valley, has predicated itself on this idea that if your code works, you get a job. So the problem is research says that's really not true. And in fact, research that came out of MIT shows that just believing that actually can cause you to make more biased decisions. So, right? So for me, people are always like, oh, but we're a meritocracy, or we don't want to lower the bar. And I am difficult, and I always say, why do you think we haven't done it already? But I think that's really important, and I've done a lot of thinking about why I see people struggle so much with this concept. And I think intellectually people get it, right? That talent or potential is equally distributed, but opportunity is not, right? And so when I see a lack of diversity, I always think, oh, well, that's a broken system. But for folks who are already in Silicon Valley, this isn't an intellectual issue. It's an emotional one and an issue of identity. If you have built your whole career on the belief that everything you have achieved is due to your own hard work and brilliance, it is an attack on yourself to understand that the industry that you have been working in gave you some advantages that have nothing to do with your innate abilities. Like, that is terrifying. And as much as it's easy to laugh about that, it's more important to have empathy for it, right? That's really terrifying. I've seen, it's one of the most amazing things. I have a developer on my Stride team in Austin who came to a training, and we talked about this, and he had like a 6-month-long cycle of the stages of grief, right? He was like, how did I not know that I have white privilege? Oh my God. I'm like, well, because you're from rural Mississippi, and like you haven't had that learning experience yet. It's okay, right? We're on the other side of that. And seeing that happen, right, like he's an amazing human being, and after about 6 months, I kind of was like, hey, woman of color, making me do emotional labor, let's get it together. And he was like, got it, okay, what do you need me to do? But it takes a long time, and you have to have an incredible amount of self-awareness and a sense of self to be able to say, I worked really hard, and I'm really smart, and also I benefited from these really messed up systems. Right? All of those things can be true at once, but it is the hardest thing for any person to do, to hold two contradictory truths at the same time. So that is why I think this idea of meritocracy is obviously damaging, but also so hard to get rid of. Because you would have to have people admit that there were other people who deserved what they got as much as they did. Right? That's like really scary for people. But it's also incredibly important where I think especially the role of academia comes into this discussion. I have won more arguments and convinced more people, proving that that is not true. Even things as simple as resume studies, which right, are not the most sophisticated research design, but the number of times that I've proposed a change that's happened because I said, well, here's the research that backs up why I'm making the recommendation and how that happens. And at Atlassian, that's how I do everything, because I don't know how to solve problems without Google Scholar. I don't have a JSTOR login anymore. It's really traumatic for me. Is that. So things like when we're doing our annual performance review process, in previous iterations of the cycle, individuals would write their own self-reviews, and then they would give them to the manager, and the manager would do their review. Well, what's wrong with that? The confidence gap for women, potential anchoring bias. It also takes 2 weeks longer during the year, right? Managers get to be lazy. So what we actually did was think about, it's little things like that, right? We rely on research to say, actually, we're going to compress this so that individuals have to write their self-review at the same time that managers do. That way you know that you're getting the most objective, or at least the most honest assessment from both sides. It turns out that that reduces the issue of the confidence gap somewhat. It makes anchoring bias impossible because the manager has no idea what the person thinks about their performance. It saves everyone 2 weeks of time. And it also helps with alignment and growth discussions. So this tiny little change to our process that was also just great for our HRBP team, it turns out that that actually changed the distribution of ratings at Atlassian. So we had seen that the women's distribution skewed slightly lower, and we corrected it, so it was fine, but it turned out that we didn't have to do that correction after making that tiny change. So in this idea of meritocracy, showing that those are the outcomes is actually really powerful. It's the same thing that allowed me to help overhaul our recruiting process such that we went from hiring 10% women in technical roles in 2014 to our entry-level class of engineers in 2017 being 57% women, right? That's huge. Yes, it was so cool. And overall, we moved that number from 10 to 18% globally, again, because women in engineering at that director and CTO level are about 5% of the market at this point. And nothing I did was rocket science, right? People are like, what's your D&I magic? I'm like, it's not, it's research. Because the other cool thing about tech and about this partnership between academia and business is that you're dealing with engineers, right? So you can just like throw 15 research studies at them and they either have to like deal with their identity as an engineer and a data person or like agree you're right. So I really like that because I like being right. But yeah, I think that this belief and the fact that we're dealing with it as a logic problem instead of an identity and an emotional problem is one of the things that makes it harder to make progress. Now the question is, are we making progress? And what would that look like? And if anyone knows me, you know that I really care a lot about data and measurement. And that's, I mean, it's trendy in D&I now, I guess, because first of all, for I think a lot of the time, tech especially thought that the entire specialty of diversity and inclusion was like kumbaya and drum circles, which it can be if you want it to be. But what we're seeing is that D&I is really being taken over by quantitative research, right? So we're backing our strategies in both taking empirically validated best practices, but then also embracing the idea that empirically validated best practices may or may not work at your organization. And that is something that I always say is they're like, when I was being interviewed for my job, they were like, so you know all the best practices. I was like, I know how they're supposed to work. I'm going to throw empirically validated spaghetti at the wall and we'll see what sticks. They hired me anyway, confusing. I think everyone was jet lagged at the time. But the industry as a whole, I already said that the media seems to have decided that we're not making progress. And I agree and I disagree. And I disagree because I don't think I have enough data to say that for sure. Because most companies, the way that they're reporting on the diversity of their workforces is not sophisticated enough to actually tell me. So I am a huge champion of looking more deeply at companies and of taking a team level approach to analyzing data. So what you'll see is that most companies say we're X percentage women, X percentage people of color, but that doesn't actually tell me a lot about the companies, and it also doesn't allow me to compare how companies are tracking against each other. Because a company like Yelp or LinkedIn, about 70% of their staff is in sales. They're competing in a very different talent market than Atlassian, which is not only 75% R&D, but mostly engineering out of Sydney, right? It's a very different set of challenges. And so I would argue that we are making progress. And the reason is because I'm seeing early signs that it's changing. For a lot of the most elite high growth companies, they've brought in a head of D&I. That's a fundamental sea change. To think about hiring a diversity leader before you've hit 10,000 employees was almost unheard of 15 years ago. So that's a sign. The other thing that I'm seeing is that companies, while those numbers are moving slowly, they are moving. And it's important to look beyond those sort of corporate level aggregates because they're just not sensitive enough to measure most year-over-year change. If you were a company like Salesforce, which isn't in high growth mode right now, which is a more mature company, you would actually have to do something illegal to move your representation of Black employees more than 1 percentage point in a year, right? That's just a fact based on the total employee size and the number of open roles that they have at any one time. And again, this is why I talk about a team level approach, and it's how we look at diversity. Because it turns out that the size of a team is pretty consistent across organizations, right? So average 6 to 12 people. Maybe there's a little more variance, but companies now are generally following the 2 pizza rule, so you're okay. Anyone not know the 2 pizza rule? Your team's too big if you can't feed it with 2 pizzas, right? Right, it's like management science right there. But right? No, I mean, but it's a good rule of thumb. And my thesis is that the industry needs to start looking at diversity at the team level, but it matters. One, because it allows us to actually compare units that are the same size. For example, because 1 percentage point at Google and Slack are just very different numbers of human beings. So we're looking at a unit that's relatively standardized in size. But the other thing is that those corporate level aggregates don't actually account for the different role distributions across the companies. It makes a lot more sense for me to compare engineering teams at Atlassian, Twitter, and Yelp than to compare marketing and engineering at Facebook, right? You're like, that's kind of obvious, but it's important, and it's not something that the industry is doing consistently. And so I think that's the next thing. Are we making progress? The industry has to get better at communicating how progress looks. The other reason team level diversity matters is because it actually is sensitive enough to show change year over year. A team at Salesforce can change composition. What I saw at Atlassian over the last year, and like I said, our latest report came out a couple of weeks ago, was that while we significantly improved our hiring of women across all levels and across all functions, and we maintained our representation of underrepresented people of color across the organization while we doubled in size, on the average engineering team, what we actually saw is that there were more people of color on that team than there had been a year ago. And so while that doesn't necessarily mean that we've reached equity, it does mean that more team members on our teams are having the experience of working with colleagues who are different than themselves. And that's a really important insight to have, because it's really hard to feel like that's progress, but it is, because introducing diversity, the first person who's underrepresented or doesn't feel like they belong in a group, that's a much harder thing to do than to be the second or the third or the fourth person. Carla Matoroso, who is the VP of Programs at Code 2040, has this really great metaphor for this. She says, diversity and inclusion in tech is like a flywheel. It's going to be really hard to get those first couple of go-arounds, but it starts accelerating, right? Because it's a self-reinforcing system. When you have a set of teams or organizations who are used to and capable of working across difference and getting the value out of that, it becomes easier to introduce other types of differences over time, right? Because that's a skill that you don't need to know how to work with people of color or women or veterans. You just need to know how to work with someone different from yourself and navigate those interpersonal challenges. So I argue that we are making progress, and we know because we're seeing some early signs in the corporate level statistics, but we're also seeing companies become more and more transparent, not just about the outcomes, but also the journey. I can tell you that CDOs, I shouldn't say this, but we have like a secret email list, and we go out for what I call empathy wine, like a silent H. But it's really amazing, and I think unlike any other specialty that I've seen in business, and that we openly share things with each other, even like hunches and ideas. It's like, hey, I'm thinking about this new thing for my ERGs. Do you want to try that out? Let me know how it goes if you get to it before I do, right? There's this incredible collaborative spirit, because there's also finally, I think, becoming a shared understanding that this is not a company-specific problem. This is an industry-level problem that will require industry-level cooperation to make it right. And so that, to me, is incredibly encouraging. So what's next in tech D&I? That's a really hard question, but what I think is that we'll see significantly more data-informed rather than data-driven work in this space, that we'll see companies starting to evolve, even just looking at the PR strategies over the last year. It went from, we love diversity and look at our numbers quickly and then go away, to here's what we did, it kind of worked, and here's what didn't work. Right, and that's like a really brave thing to do if you're a public company. If you haven't been locked down by your PR teams like I have, is that companies are starting to be honest about how hard the progress is, which I think is helpful. You're also starting to see earlier and earlier stage companies beginning to invest in this. So companies like Intel and Google, that's really hard. But companies like Asana, which was founded by one of the co-founders of Facebook, hired in their D&I lead when they were just 350 employees. That's an incredible sea change. And we haven't even given those changes enough time to take full effect to understand how far we've come. So I'm incredibly optimistic, both by orientation, but also on this particular topic. So I wanted to leave a little bit of time to just chat and have questions, because I realize people usually have burning ones. But if there were a couple of lessons that I would say take away from this, it's first, remember that diversity drives value, both for individuals, for teams, for organizations, and for their customers, right? This is a win-win-win situation. It's not zero-sum. The meritocracy does not exist, like Lindsay Lohan and that limit in Mean Girls, right? Yeah, it does not exist. And in fact, no one Mean Girls fan? All right. But diversity is a sign that you've built a meritocracy. So when people say, I don't want to lower the bar, my underlying assumption, and I'm very open with it, is that if you have a homogenous team that you've already done it, and I'm trying to get you to raise your standards. And the last is that there just is no best practice. The fact is that we're working on an unsolved, incredibly complex, industry-wide problem that has implications for basically every area of human society. So not something that I can do on Saturday afternoon. And so we really don't know a lot. We don't have a lot of the answers, but what's really exciting to me is that the industry overall, and this is in Silicon Valley, but I can speak globally, is that we're starting to bring data to the problem, which wasn't happening 10 years ago. D&I is probably one of the last specialties in HR that's been consumed by this idea of big data and measurement and science. But it's really exciting because even though we're at the beginning and it's easy to wish we were further along, it also means that there's a lot of opportunity as someone who really knows that space, if you are in academia, to have impact and make sure they don't do it wrong yet. Right? So you don't have to get rid of bad practices and put in new ones. Rather, we can really shape the discussion. And I've also been really encouraged by the geographies outside of Silicon Valley. A lot of them actually haven't been having this conversation as much, but I found that that's really great, both because they're not aware enough to cover up their own bias. They're just like right there, you can just point at it, and they're like, yeah, no, that's bad, let's not do that. But also it means that they can get over some of the issues that Silicon Valley has struggled with in this discussion. The most obvious one is the fact that people seem to believe that diversity equals gender diversity, right? Which basically causes the erasure of queer women, of women of color, of people with disabilities and veterans, people who have marginalized identities that aren't visible. And so if you think about it from that perspective, we're at the beginning, but we're at a really interesting inflection point where all of these capitalist structures have agreed that they want to put money against it, and they don't know what you're doing. So swoop in and tell them. Like, that was my method. I was like, I've got 12 months before people figure out I don't know how to do this. So I've got to get something going before then. And I did, and it worked. So I would encourage you all to keep that mindset when you're thinking about these problems. If you're in academia, yes, publish, do all those things, but how can you distill and share that knowledge in a way that is useful to people who do not have masters or PhDs? What I have found from my fellow CDOs is that I tend to be the most academic and quanti of all of us. They tend to be people with amazing backgrounds in program management, incredible expertise in D&I, but some of them struggle to translate the research in the way that they can apply it in their organizations. And so there is an incredible value add to thinking about how you engage in the non-academic community and share the knowledge that's being created in these spaces. And it's also really great, I hope I've been useful with my friends who are still in academia, saying, well, here's how it works in the world, right? Because some theoretical constructs don't translate perfectly, and it's really going to take people with expertise in both of those domains to figure out how to make that work. So now I have questions, but thank you so much. This has been so much fun.
Very, very few questions for really, really We're just going to set up for the next panel while we take some questions.
All right, cool. I was like, we have 20 minutes, is that right? Good on time? Anyone? Questions? Comments, concerns? Yeah.
So one of the things that you talked about was people saying like, oh,
Hello. One of the things you talked about was companies saying that you don't want to lower the bar. But one of the things that I'm hearing at the companies that I've worked at is more of, especially at a startup, you're going kind of through these growth spurts, and they'll say, we don't have time, right? We desperately need to hire a backend engineer right now, and we just want someone that's good. So if a white male comes in and we think he's good, we're gonna go with it. How, do you have any recommendations for sort of how do you combat that in terms of, yes, we need someone because we are, we need the resource, but also we want to get this in there,
Totally. So one of the things that I find in those discussions, which is sort of subtext to what you said, is that they're looking for someone who can execute on the technical domain, right? They're like, I need you to build a database or whatever backend engineers do. I'm sorry, not that good. I only know how to code in R. And I think that's actually a really poor way to think about it, especially for early stage companies. Because the fact is, the marginal ad of one individual person fundamentally changes your culture and fundamentally changes your company. And you're dealing in incredibly high risk, high reward situations. And so making a shitty hire is both expensive and can also kill your company. And so if you're only looking at technical skill or what that person can bring in a very narrow set of roles, you're actually doing your company a disservice. One, because there's probably 1 million back-end engineers in the Valley, right? That's just a fact. But are you actually hiring someone who has the skills to grow in the role at the rate that your company is growing? Are they capable of adding value to the people around them? Because if that's not true, you just hired a very, very expensive deadweight. And I think that's important because the Valley doesn't necessarily think about hiring people that way, right? They're like, you can code, you're great. And it turns out that those people are really expensive because over time, you end up having to get rid of them. And getting rid of people is expensive. Then you have to rehire them. And that doesn't even count the second order effects of if they cause someone else in your organization to leave. And so, yes, it is an argument that I'm not asking you to like take 6 months to find someone instead of a week. I'm asking you to take a month. And yes, that feels like a millennia in startup time. But as a leader, as a CEO, if you're dealing with companies that small, you need to be investing in the long-term success of your business, right? And also trying to think further ahead. So if you anticipate that you're going to have greater back-end needs, asking someone to have a 3-week head start, all right, is probably a reasonable ask. And the other thing is what's really amazing now is that there are all of these nonprofit partners and also companies you can pay for if you have venture funding. Investing in your people is a really good thing to do. Is that it's really hard to say that I can't find X person. I can tell you I have done a lot of market mapping. If you were trying to hire a CTO candidate that is a underrepresented woman in Sydney, it's really hard, right? But we have a lot more humans in America than that. So you can find people, but it does take time, and you probably have to look outside of just LinkedIn. I mean, weird fact for everyone, I follow hashtags on Twitter that are associated with underrepresented people in technology, and I tweet job ads at people who are participating in them. I'm not even joking. I'm like, hi, you look like a great UX designer. We have these 3 open jobs. And I also look at things like, I go through like the technology books on Amazon, and I read the book reviews and then try to find the people who wrote the book reviews. Because women tend to write more than men do, and no one's going to write a book review of like a Node.js book unless they actually know what they're talking about. So it's about being creative, right? And creative problem solving, which is something that entrepreneurs are actually, well, better positioned to do than a lot of other people. So yeah, they just need to reframe the problem and understand that they already have the skills and they just need to apply them in a different arena. Now you all know my weird sourcing tactics. All right. Cool. All right, I think we're good? Okay, cool. Thank you so much, everyone.